approximately 28 AD, in a region under full military occupation, with tax rates that consumed between 35 and 90% of a farming family's annual income, where a single bad harvest meant not debt, but displacement, where the average life expectancy hovered around 40 years, and the majority of the population lived one crisis away from losing everything they owned. Jesus looked at a crowd of those people and said, "Do not worry." This video is about what he actually meant by that, because I want to suggest to you that the version of that command most of us received in church is missing something critical, something that only becomes visible when you understand the world those words landed in. We are going to look at the first-century Roman economic system that formed the backdrop of the Sermon on the Mount. We are going to look at the original Greek word translated as worry and what it actually describes. And we are going to land on what the command actually requires of you today, not as a spiritual feeling, but as a psychological and practical reorientation of where you build your foundation. This is going to take about 19 minutes. It is worth it. Let us establish the scene. First-century Galilee was not a place of spiritual leisure. It was an occupied territory under the administration of the Roman Empire, the most sophisticated and ruthless tax collection apparatus the ancient world had ever produced. Rome did not govern Galilee directly at this point. They used a layered system of client kings and local administrators, Herod Antipas in this region, who collected taxes on Rome's behalf and kept a portion for themselves. What this created was not a single tax burden, but a cascading series of extractions at every level of the economic chain. Historians estimate the combined tax burden on a Galilean farming family included the following: Roman tribute, approximately 12% of grain production, 20% of fruit and oil, Herodian taxes on top of that, temple tax, mandatory for every adult Jewish male, toll taxes on goods moved between territories, and the corvée system, mandatory unpaid labor for Roman infrastructure projects that could pull a farmer away from his own land during critical growing seasons. Combined, conservative estimates put the total tax burden at between 35 and 40% of annual income. Less conservative estimates put it significantly higher. For context, a Galilean subsistence farmer was typically working a plot of land between 2 and 10 acres, not enough to generate surplus, exactly enough to feed a family if the harvest was good, the weather cooperated, and nothing went wrong. If something went wrong, they borrowed. If they could not repay, they lost the land. If they lost the land, they became tenant farmers, working land they used to own for landlords who took a percentage of everything they produced. This was the economic reality of the majority of people sitting on that hillside, listening to the Sermon on the Mount. The tenant farming system in first-century Palestine deserves particular attention because it is the direct context of the agricultural imagery Jesus uses in Matthew 6. When a family lost their land to debt, which happened with increasing frequency under Roman economic pressure, they did not simply become unemployed. They typically remained on the same land as tenant farmers, sharecroppers, or day laborers, 3 distinct categories with 3 distinct levels of economic precarity. Tenant farmers negotiated a fixed payment, usually a percentage of the harvest, to the absentee landlord who now owned the land. In good years, this was manageable. In bad years, when drought or disease reduced the yield, the fixed payment remained. The tenant farmer absorbed the loss entirely. Sharecroppers worked under even less favorable terms. The landlord took a portion of the actual crop before the farmer had covered his own household's food needs. Day laborers, the tokos, the truly poor, had no land relationship at all. They stood in the marketplace at dawn, waiting to be hired for whatever work was available that day. If no one hired them, they did not eat that day. These are the people in the crowd. This is who Jesus is looking at when he says, "Consider the birds of the air. They neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them." He is not speaking to comfortable people about a theoretical problem. He is speaking to people for whom food security was a genuine daily uncertainty. A Galilean farming family in the 1st century would have spent the majority of their waking hours in direct service of one objective: making it through the season. The agricultural calendar left almost no margin. Plowing began in October after the early rains. Grain was sown between November and January. The critical spring harvest ran from April through June. A family that missed a window due to illness, required labor service, or equipment failure did not recover that season. Every conversation, every decision, every relationship was filtered through the question, what does this mean for the harvest? What does this mean for the tax payment? What does this mean for whether we eat this winter? This is what the scholars call a survival orientation, a cognitive and emotional state in which the entire attentional system, every faculty of the mind, is allocated to immediate material threat. Long-term thinking becomes inaccessible. Creativity disappears. Relationships exist primarily as survival networks. Everything is downstream of the question, will we make it? Sound familiar? It should, because the neuroscience of what those 1st century farmers were experiencing is identical to what we now call survival mode. The names have changed. The mechanism has not. One final detail before we move to the text. The tax collection system in 1st century Palestine operated through a practice called tax farming. Rome did not employ its own collectors. It auctioned the right to collect taxes in a given region to private contractors, the Tenant, who paid Rome up front and then collected from the population whatever they could extract above that amount. The profit motive was built in. The more they collected beyond their Roman payment, the more they kept. There was no audit, no appeal, no oversight beyond what local power structures could enforce. This is why tax collectors in the Gospels are always paired with sinners, not as a moral judgment by the Gospel writers, but as an accurate reflection of how the population experienced them. They were not civil servants. They were, in the experience of most Galileans, extraction agents, operating with legal authority and no accountability. This is the economic system Jesus was speaking into when he said, "Do not worry about what you will eat, or what you will drink, or what you will wear." Matthew 6:25. In English, do not worry. In the original Greek, merimnate, from the root word merimna. Most English translations render this as worry, anxiety, or care. These are not wrong translations, but they are incomplete ones. And the incompleteness matters. The word merimna comes from two Greek roots, merizo, meaning to divide or separate, and nous, meaning mind. A divided mind, not an anxious feeling, not a worried emotion, a mind that has been split, fractured, pulled in multiple directions simultaneously until it cannot function as a unified whole. The ancient concept is more precise than our modern one. When Jesus says merimnate, he is not describing a feeling state. He is describing a cognitive condition, a structural problem in how the mind is organizing its attention and allocating its resources. The divided mind of the 1st century farmer was divided between the harvest and the tax, between feeding the family and paying the landlord, between this week's survival and next season's planting. Every decision point fractured into competing obligations with no clear hierarchy and no stable ground to stand on. That is Merimna. That is what Jesus is addressing. Modern psychology defines anxiety as a future-oriented mood state, characterized by apprehension about potential negative outcomes. That definition is accurate as far as it goes, but notice what it focuses on: the feeling, the emotional experience of apprehension. The ancient concept of Merimna focuses not on the feeling, but on the structural condition that produces it. A mind divided against itself, a cognitive system that cannot form a unified orientation toward life because it is being pulled simultaneously toward incompatible demands. This distinction matters enormously for how you respond to the command. If "do not worry" means "do not feel anxious," the command is essentially impossible. You cannot decide not to feel a feeling. Anyone who has ever told themselves, "just stop worrying," and had it work, please let the rest of us know how. But if "do not worry" means do not allow your mind to be structurally divided, do not build your psychological foundation on material variables you cannot control, do not let your entire attentional system be colonized by survival calculations, now the command becomes actionable. Go back to Matthew 6. After the command, Jesus does not immediately give a solution. He gives illustrations: the birds of the air, the lilies of the field. To a modern reader, these feel like comfort, nice images, reminders of God's provision. To a first-century farmer, these illustrations are almost confrontational. Birds do not sow, they do not reap, they do not gather into barns, and yet they are fed. The agricultural vocabulary here is deliberate. Jesus is using the exact language of the farming system that has colonized every waking hour of his audience's attention: sow, reap, gather, barn, and pointing at creatures who participate in none of it and still survive. The lilies of the field. Solomon, in all his glory, the wealthiest king in Israel's history, was not dressed as beautifully as these. And they do not labor, they do not spin. The word translated as labor here, kopiao in the Greek, means to toil to the point of exhaustion. It is the same word used elsewhere to describe the crushing physical labor of servants and slaves. Jesus is not telling his audience that work is unnecessary. He is telling them that the exhausting, mind-dividing, survival-oriented labor that has become the entire structure of their existence is not the foundation God designed them to build on. So what is the command actually requiring? Matthew 6:33. Jesus has spent 8 verses building the case. The birds, the lilies, the rhetorical questions, the systematic dismantling of material survival as a psychological foundation. And then he lands it. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Seek first. Not seek only. Not ignore material reality. Not stop farming or stop planning or stop working. First, as in establish the primary orientation of your mind before the survival calculations begin. Build your psychological foundation on something that does not move when the harvest fails, or the tax collector arrives, or the economy shifts, or the diagnosis comes back wrong. The Merimna, the divided mind, is produced by having no stable primary orientation. When everything is equally urgent and nothing is foundational, the mind fractures under the competing weight of it all. Seek first the kingdom is not a spiritual platitude. It is a cognitive architecture instruction. Establish one primary anchor, one fixed point that does not move with circumstances, and organize everything else beneath it. The economic pressures of the 1st century and the economic pressures of the 21st century are not identical. But the psychological mechanism they produce is. You may not be a tenant farmer paying Roman taxes, but you may be a person whose entire attentional system has been colonized by material survival calculations: the mortgage, the job, the market, the inbox, the next crisis arriving before the last one has resolved. A mind in that state is experiencing Merimna, a divided mind. And the command of Matthew 6:25 applies to it with the same force it applied to the Galilean farmer in 28 AD. So here is the actual directive. First, identify your primary anchor, not as a theological category, as a daily practice. Before the inbox, before the market opens, before the survival calculations begin. What is the one thing that does not change, regardless of what the day brings? Start there, anchor there, every morning. Second, audit your attention. The Merimna Jesus is addressing is not primarily an emotional problem. It is an attentional one. Where is your mind spending most of its processing power? What is it returning to when you are not deliberately directing it elsewhere? That is your actual foundation, not the one you claim theologically, but the one your attention reveals. Third, rebuild the hierarchy deliberately. Seek first means the kingdom orientation must precede the survival orientation, not replace it. You still plan, you still work, you still make provision, but you do these things from a mind that has already established what is actually foundational and what is merely circumstantial. That reordering, practiced consistently, daily, over time, is what Romans 12:2 calls the renewing of the mind. It is what produces the transformation that is not possible from inside a divided mind trying to manage competing emergencies. The first-century farmer listening to Jesus had no control over the Roman tax system, no control over the weather, no control over the absentee landlord or the price of grain at market, or whether the corvée system would pull him from his field during planting season. What he had control over was where he built his psychological foundation, what he treated as primary, what he let organize everything else beneath it, and that, in a world of total economic vulnerability, was not a small thing. It was the only thing, the one variable entirely within his jurisdiction. Jesus was not telling him that the harvest would always come in. He was not promising that the tax collector would leave him alone. He was not offering a prosperity guarantee dressed up as spiritual teaching. He was telling him that a mind built on the kingdom can navigate anything the empire throws at it without fracturing. And 2,000 years later, with different empires, different tax systems, different survival pressures, but the same divided human mind, that is still the directive. Build the foundation that does not move. Seek that first, and then watch what becomes possible from a mind that is no longer fractured. If this changed how you read Matthew 6, share it with someone who has been told to just stop worrying and found it less than helpful. Drop in the comments the one thing your mind keeps returning to that is fracturing it right now. Not to fix it here, but because naming it is the first step toward building the foundation that does not move with it. Subscribe. Every video on this channel goes this deep. We will see you in the next one.